Joining us via Skype from Houston is a lead activist and organizer for White Lives Matter, Ken Reed. Ken, first and foremost, what's the whole point of carrying the Confederate flags when it was General Lee, who was the leader of the Confederate troops, told those troops to furl that flag and store it in your attics for the rest of your lives? Why are you carrying that from the NAACP when that was exactly what General Lee said to the Confederate troops?
And I do agree 100% that General Lee did make that statement. But in modern times, to people who live in southern parts of the country, all it represents to us is a form of our heritage. This is Texas.
Actually, Ken, let me correct you on that. The fact of the matter is that Confederate flag was furled in those attics for at least 2 generations. Do you know when that Confederate flag was then pulled out? It was pulled out in 1948 when segregationists had their rally in 1948 to oppose civil rights. You do know when they raised that flag on the state capital of South Carolina, it was opposed to the issue of integration. So the reality is, when you spoke of modern times, the reason that flag reappeared in America was because of the opposition to the civil rights movement. That's called a fact, Ken.
Well, that might be true, but I'm talking about for my...
It's not might, it is. Do you believe the NAACP is racist or not?
I definitely believe they're biased because they favor colored people over white people.
Do you know that the majority of the NAACP founders, which came out of the Niagara movement, were white?
I do, absolutely.
Do you realize,
but not anymore.
Do you realize that there are white members of the NAACP?
I do.
So the reality is the NAACP, over their history, they've actually fought for policies that have actually benefited you as a white man. Did you realize that?
We might have been. I'm not saying that didn't happen. I'm not saying that. And we might have gotten some fringe benefits, but their specific goal, yes, meaning this, their specific goal is for colored people. But yes, white women, disabled people, they all might have benefited from it as well.
Not might, they have.
Well,
but Ken, let me ask you a question. Ken, if you actually, do you realize that, Ken, did you go to the public school?
As a child, yes.
Yes. Do you realize that public schools were not taxpayer financed in the 1800s? Do you realize that it was freed slaves in Texas who were elected to the Texas legislature, which actually put it in the Constitution for there to be publicly financed education? So do you realize that even going forward, the NAACP has been fighting for that? So the NAACP, fighting for public education, has been fighting for white people like you to get educated.
All of that, what you're saying, is fine and dandy. I believe Black Lives Matter has the right to fight for their rights, their lives, their civil liberties here in the United States. I feel that whites have the right to say white lives matter and fight for their rights and their civil liberties and their heritage and culture, just like every people in the United States have the right to do so.
Well, last I checked, when 80% of the men in 80% of the people in the United States Senate are white men, when you have Fortune 500 companies, and you have more than 90%, more than 90% of the folks sit on the boards of directors are white men. When you also look at the fact that you have right now no African Americans in the country who are governors of states, I would surmise to say white folks have had it pretty good in America since the first Africans arrived in 1619. Ken Reed, y'all had it pretty good. Ken Reed, we appreciate it.
It can't get worse.